Okay, now I think we're working. I think. This one was on to begin with, I trust. Whew. Okay, high tech. Reminds me of, trying to get the microphones right, reminds me of Anglican conference, and the bishop was there and was going to speak and was trying to get the microphone to work, and spoke into it and said, "There's something wrong with this mic." And good Anglicans, as trained as they are, said, "And also with you." I won't bash too many other denominations, just a few. 10 years ago I didn't need these things, but time marches on. Well, I know I'm a comer from away, but it's some good to be here. Bob called me up and waxed eloquent on the phone about coming and doing the Simpson lectures, and I got all excited. Now, oh boy, this is going to be great. This is going to be neat to come back to Acadia Divinity College and connect up and speak again. And so I signed up on the dotted line, and then he said, "Oh yeah, and it's in February." Then when I got here, I found out that it's one of the local truisms that the worst weather of the year occurs during the Simpson lectures. So, although that wind does remind me of Block Island, so I feel a little bit at home that way. But truly, it's good to be here. I appreciate this opportunity. And I'm glad most of you are sitting in the upper half there, the back half. That makes me feel like I'm right at home. But I'm excited about small churches. I'm excited about the Church of Jesus Christ, and particularly small churches. In Canada and the United States, there's approximately 200,000 small churches. Points of light, you might say, frontier posts in the spiritual warfare. Places where persons experience God's love in the sense of family and high-touch environment, where resurrection and redemption and transformation of human life is possible, and kingdom values can be lived out, and we can actually have on earth a foretaste of heaven. So, I'm glad to be here, glad to be talking about the Church of Jesus Christ, glad to be talking about small churches. I have some hopes for these 3 days together. One hope is that we leave with greater awareness of the nature of the churches in which we minister. Now, I'm not going to presume to tell you about the sociology or the culture of the Atlantic provinces and the Maritimes. I don't know as much as you know, obviously. I know hardly anything. So I'm going to stick to areas that I think I do know something about, and that is the dynamics of small churches. But I hope our awareness will increase. I hope our attitude will also be encouraged. I hope we'll go home with some heart. I hope you'll go home thinking that my church is a dynamo, at least in potential. And we have something we can do for the kingdom that's great and that's eternal. And I hope you'll take at least one action step to accomplish that. And my last hope is that we're going to have a good time together. I'm getting older every year. It's amazing. I don't have enough time to be bored or frustrated or have bad experiences. So we'll have a good time together, which I guess translates to, if you're going to sleep through these lectures, at least don't snore. Okay? Now, even though I'm a Baptist, we do have a plan for these 3 evenings here. And in your brochure it says history, histrionics, and hope. We're going to be looking at history tonight, or if that's, maybe you don't like alliteration, how about some good Greek words? Gnosis, tomorrow night diagnosis, and Wednesday night prognosis. Or if that's too complicated, how about past, present, and future? All right, let's look at the history of the small church. What is the God-given nature of the small church that has been revealed? And I'd like to start each evening with a little Bible reading, a little reading from the Bible, and then a little vignette. So tonight we'll look at Matthew 12, 46 through 50. When I'm going to be doing an Old Testament reading later on, and I travel with the New Testament, so I stole Gideon's Bible out of my hotel room, but you might recognize the King James here. Matthew 12, starting at 46. While he yet talked to the people, behold, his mother, this is Jesus, his mother and his brethren stood without, desiring to speak with him. Then one said unto him, Behold, thy mother and thy brethren stand without, desiring to speak with thee. But he answered and said unto him that told him, Who is my mother, and who are my brethren? And he stretched forth his hand towards his disciples and said, Behold my mother and my brethren. For whosoever shall do the will of my Father which is in heaven, the same is my brother and my sister and my mother. What would you give to be sitting in a group at the feet of Jesus and have Jesus gesture and say, Here are my brothers and my sisters, my family? What would you give to experience that? Hold that thought. I want to tell you about one of my churches. It's the oldest Baptist church in Massachusetts, First Baptist Church of Swansea. They're a small church, probably 60 at worship would be a really good Sunday, but they are a very happy church. I was visiting in another church on a Saturday evening. They were doing a long-range planning session, and it was one of the most discouraging experiences of my life. We went through the whole evening. Not a good word was said, although I did take notes, 3 notes on 3 particular things that could be interpreted positively. And at the end of the meeting, I said, well, you know, we can rejoice. Look, here's 3 things that I counted that you shared with me that seem positive. And they said, they just were in no mood to rejoice, and I went home so discouraged with this black cloud sitting right on my head. And I got up Sunday morning. I had no commitment, very unusual situation. And I said, where can I go to refresh my spirit? And I said, First Baptist Church of Swansea. So I drove down to Swansea, and they had just celebrated, which I didn't realize, Vacation Bible School, and they had all the artwork displayed on the chancel, and they had the kids come up and with kazoos to do one of the songs that they learned at Vacation Bible School, and I'm feeling better already. And we had some rain that morning, but we'd been experiencing a drought, and so one of the deacons got up and he said, well, let me explain something to you. That moisture that's coming down from heaven, that's called rain, and we all laughed and had a good old time. The spirit was just very uplifting. This is the document that they produced. They started out in Rhode Island. Good place for Baptist churches to start. But one winter they decided they didn't like it there anymore, and they moved the church on ice over to its present location. And the church at that time was 22 feet high, 33 feet wide, and 41.5 feet long. How about that? They're a fascinating congregation. They enjoy their history. Another interesting thing about them is they've always been about the same size that they are now. They've oscillated a little up, a little down, but they stay right in that range where they can be family together. I want to come back to them, but keep them in your mind also. Small church. Some think the very name is pejorative. I'm going to be publishing a little booklet with the United Methodists on self-esteem in the small church in a couple of months. And their whole series is not on vital ministry in the small church. They don't like that title. Vital ministry in the small membership church feels a little better to them. Episcopal canon Caroline Westerhoff wrote an article in which she said she didn't like the word small. She looked it up in the thesaurus and found 26 negative synonyms, including trifling, petty, fragile, and faint. She prefers the term ordinary-sized churches. But whatever you want to call it, the reality is not valued even by churchologists. Get this page from one of Bill Easom's manuals. Small churches seldom grow, and when they do, it is rarely, reluctantly, only with pain, because of a flood of newcomers into the area, or when the pastor gives up any personal life. And other people say equally encouraging things. Marshall Shearer writes, identify small membership congregations as those without adequate financial, material, and human resources to engage in a meaningful program for a church. John Mason wrote, churches of under 200 members have an insufficient human resource base for the gifts of the Holy Spirit to be fully utilized. Church consultant James Lowry cites a New York State Council of Churches statement from the 1960s that sets numerical quotas for church viability. For fellowship and worship, you need 50 persons. Don't try fellowshipping with 49, it doesn't work. For property ownership, 200 members. For a total pastoral unit, the famous TPU, 350 members. But if you have 2 buildings, you need 400. Below these is a small, non-viable church or congregation. They survive, hang on by their fingernails, and do little else. Well, if you're like me, you say ouch when you hear those kinds of assessments. But I'm hoping you're going to feel like you're at the doctor's office and you say, I have a pain, and so the doctor pokes here and pokes there and pokes there. And finally, when you say ouch, you know that's where the problem is. We're not going to be in denial. We're going to put these negative assessments on the table and deal with the true issues. But I'm not negative about the small church. In fact, I think the small church is beautiful. And I want to share with you 6 or 7 reasons. I'm indecisive on why I think the small church is beautiful. Now, we need to have a caution here to begin with, and that is that not all small churches are beautiful because they're small churches. I mean, we can say that the human spirit is a wonderful creation of God. It's capable of wonderful sacrifice, nobility, and gestures of grace and love and beauty. And then we can say, well, what about Uncle Pete? He's the most ornery son of a gun on this side of the mountains. So not all human spirit is beautiful. And just so not all small churches are beautiful. But the small church is created by God with the capacity to be beautiful. And the first reason that I think it's beautiful is a biblical reason. If you have your Bibles, you can turn along to Deuteronomy 7, 6 through 9. You'll probably remember this passage even if you don't have your Bible. For thou art a holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself above all people that are upon the face of the earth. The Lord did not set his love upon you, nor chose you, because ye were more in number than any people, for ye were the fewest of all people. But because the Lord loved you, and because he would keep the oath which he had sworn to you fathers, hath the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand, and redeemed you out of the house of bondmen, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord thy God, he is God, the faithful God, which keepeth covenant and mercy with them that love him, and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations. A Jesuit scholar named Norbert Wolfink talks about this election by God of the smallest people, the smallest nation, the smallest tribe. And he says what God was doing was creating a contrast society, a society that would contrast with the great kingdoms and empires of that day and age, and in their difference show the very nature of God. And Wolfink lists these qualities. This contrast society would be centered on the true God. People would live in them with a brother and sister relationship. Poverty would be addressed by caring. Each person would be a priest. What a huge contrast that was to Egypt. They would be a holy people, keeping the laws of God, and they would be a wise and righteous people. They would, in fact, be the people of God. If we flip over to the New Testament, 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 8 and 9 and 10. But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, which in times past were not a people, but are now the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Peter's saying a very peculiar thing. Once you were not a people, because those who came to faith in Jesus Christ were often the uprooted and the displaced people of the first century in the Mediterranean world through crop failure, disease, Roman military action. For some reason, people had left their family of origin, their tribe, their city of origin, and gone to the urban centers in the Roman Empire, and there heard the witness to Jesus Christ, were convicted, and came to faith in Jesus Christ, and joined the church. All of these different people with all these different backgrounds were not a people, but they became the people of God. I believe that the small church is the contemporary manifestation of this biblical reality, the people of God. Historical reason is number 2. The first form of the church was the house church. In Philemon's we read, the church that meets in your home. And in Galatians 6, the church is described and even defined as the household of faith. This was the early church pattern. Robert Banks, in his book Paul's Idea of Community, says it is in the home of one of the members that ecclesia is held. He goes on to say that there were no special buildings, no special church buildings until the 3rd century. So for over 2 centuries, the church met virtually exclusively in the home of one of the members. In the Greco-Roman world, the well-to-do household might have a guest room that would hold up to 30 people with an absolute maximum of 45. He goes on to say, we must not think of congregations as particularly large. Even the meetings of the quote-unquote whole church were small enough for a relatively intimate relationship to develop between the members. This entity that went from 12 people cowering in the upper room to 300 years later overcoming the Roman Empire had as its primary pattern groups of 30 or less. Third reason I think the small church is beautiful is the psychological reason. We each need positive primary relationships. If we're introverts, we need a few deep ones. If we're extroverts, we need a good band of broad ones. But we each need face-to-face relationships where we're known by name, where there's high touch in a world that's increasingly high-tech. Somebody said recently, you know, high-tech is fine, you have this sense of personal freedom, but who's going to come to your funeral? It's an interesting question. And we crave a family feeling. We want to feel at home somewhere. We want to be loved, warts and all. We want to be comfortable where we can be before we do. I have a new colleague has joined us in Massachusetts, and one of my old colleagues was asking me for some advice. He said he talked to her about something and she kind of jumped on him. And now he was watching his words, and he had, whenever he conversed with her, now he was having performance anxiety. And he was really upset about this. And so we talked for a while, but it struck me. We want to be in a place where we're not on stage, where everything we say isn't monitored and evaluated, where we can just be in relationship and be accepted. All of us want and need that. And when these things happen in a church, it cannot happen in a big number. David Ray says it has to happen in a context of 125 or less. He says that once a church hits more than 125, in order to have that family feeling, the deacons have to organize it. But up to 125, you can have it just by being church together, just by being a small church. Fourth reason is the sociological reason. We each need a referent group. We each need some place to say, I belong, to have an identifiable group that can give to us identity. Carl Dudley describes the small church as a single cell of caring people, and to know that you belong in that cell is very important. I don't know if you sing, do you have a hymn that you sing up here, Who is on the Lord's Side? Okay, I'm not going to burst into song, but When you ask that question in the small church, the answer is given in particular names. We know the group that we are connected to. A story was told about an Episcopal gentleman. He went to church every Sunday, unlocked the building, sat in an empty sanctuary for an hour, prayed and thought, locked the building on his way out, went home again. Turns out, eventually his faith was rewarded and the congregation reformed, and there was ministry there. But I often wonder, what was the motivation of that gentleman to go Sunday after Sunday? And I think there may be many motivations, but I think one of them was that when he went there, although he was seeing it at its very weakest, at its lowest ebb, that he knew he had somehow connected with something that was greater than himself that might yet vindicate his allegiance. Fifth reason is the anthropological reason. We talked a little bit about the people of God. God created human beings, I believe, to live in that kind of relationships, to live in tribal relationships, to live as a people. And for thousands of years, humanity has known that pattern and that form. I hope my memory is correct, but I've had the privilege some years ago of going to Israel and seeing the sites there. And one of the things that fascinated me was in Jericho, seeing a section of a wall that was built to define the town of Jericho, and the guide saying, if my memory is correct, that it was a 9,000-year-old construction, the oldest known human construct. Society had to get relatively sophisticated to build walls and defenses at that point, so it must be thousands of years earlier than that people were living together in tribal kinds of relationships. I think that's the original way God made us, and I think we're hardwired to enjoy that kind of social structure. And I think of all the social institutions today, there are only a few that approximate this tribal quality. Sometimes small towns, ethnic neighborhoods, but I think there's only one that combines both the social dimension and the spiritual truth of new life in Jesus Christ, and that is the small church. The sixth reason is the situational reason. Today we small church folk live in shadows, and we've forgotten the sunlight. And the shadows that we live in started about 100 years ago with mass transportation. Now this is a peculiar thing, but follow this line of argument here. And I stumbled on this because I'm a baseball fan, and we in New England are hoping that the lightning that the Patriots caught in a bottle can be transferred over to the Red Sox. You can see I'm a man of great faith. Major League Baseball started about 1900. The modern era of baseball is considered to start in 1900. And the reason is that trolleys and subways came into being in our largest cities at that time, and so 10, 15, 20, 25,000 people could go to an event that lasted 2 hours and come home for supper. First time in human history that this could happen on an ongoing basis. Well, it wasn't just baseball games that people went to. On Sunday morning, they went to church, and we had the phenomenon of the large steeple church in our downtown urban areas. And those large churches, new as they were, came to cast a large shadow on the rest of the churches and our consciousness of what churches were about. Now, these large churches have since moved out to the suburbs and now have been reformed in mega churches, but we continue to live in the shadow of these larger churches. But the interesting fact in all of this, if you're following this little excursion here, is that for the first 1900 years of the Church of Jesus Christ, the small church was the normative form of Christ's body. Somehow God did everything God wanted to accomplish in 1900 years with small churches. Seventh reason is functional reason. I came across a book a couple years ago called Natural Church Development. Some of you familiar with that? Christian Schwartz is the author. He's a church consultant, but I think primarily a researcher, and he's done surveys of thousands of churches with millions of respondents on all 6 continents. I guess he didn't make it to Antarctica, but at any rate. And he came up with some very interesting findings relative to small churches. He says, for example, the larger the church, the more likely it is to be declining. We usually think the larger the church, the stronger it must be. Not necessarily so. He has this thing called quality index, and he assigns points. Small churches on average come out 4 points ahead of large churches, and that's a significant statistical difference in his system. He says small churches per capita win 16 times more people to Jesus Christ than megachurches. And then he sums it all up by saying nearly all quality factors, the small church rates higher than the large church. Well, I hope I've convinced you that, maybe I haven't convinced you the small church is beautiful, but at least convinced you to take another look at the small church. I think we in fact are the form, the social structure that God has created for worship of the Almighty. Now let's talk a little bit about how the small church functions, what is its nature, and what are the ways in which it differs from functioning in the dominant society. I think we're going to look at 5 of these. Some people like lists, so I hope the majority of you like lists, because I'm giving you some lists here. And I know somebody's going to ask me, and the question and answer is, on the first list, what was the 4th item? But at any rate. Okay, first one is that the small church works in a personal, not a programmatic way. I enjoy Garrison Keillor, and one of his great quotes is that people from Lake Wobegon think that the Grand Canyon looks a lot grander if there's somebody from Lake Wobegon in the picture that you snap of it. And that's really true for small churches. We live on the personal level. Someone said, you know you're in a small church when you miss worship on Sunday and get 6 get well cards in Monday's mail. Went to a small church a couple towns over from where I live the other day to work with them in their search committee process, and got there a few minutes early, and the chairman of the deacon board was there, and she led me around to the on the chancel. They have some windows, some small windows there, and they had decided to do stained glass, to have people donate stained glass windows as they wanted to fill in each of these small windows, and there's about 12 of them, I think. And she went and walked me one by one. Who gave it, who it was given in memory of, why that person was significant. Absolutely irrelevant to the agenda of the evening, but absolutely front burner for her. And the pride and the love was just oozing out of her, and I had, it would have been stupid of me to say, what's this got to do with what we're doing tonight? Because the personal is the front burner, isn't it, in small churches. Secondly, small church values the past more than the future. Past is reality. We've been there. We know it. Future, who knows? Sometimes the best you can hope for in the future is that the past is not too significantly eroded. We attach emotion to the past, call it the good old days, and we get nostalgic. We remember when. Continuity is a much greater value for us than discontinuity, which also goes by the word improvement. Anthropologist once said of a tribe in Africa that she was studying, they're not greedy for the future. And that applies to small church people too. They don't do much long-range planning. You can imagine if they're this much oriented on the past and not the future, long-range planning is a kind of an alien enterprise. One pastor from New Hampshire told me that her small church did long-range planning, and I said, oh yeah? Never heard of one that did long-range planning. Tell me, how do they do it? Well, every quarter, the leaders of the church meet. They get a calendar out, and they say, okay, what did we do last year in this quarter? And what dates does that fall on this year? That's it. Long-range planning, small church style. But we value the past. That is our point of reference. David Ray also tells a story about a church in Wakefield, Massachusetts, when he was pastoring there, that was stuck. They were meeting in a home, and they were bursting out, and there was tension in the congregation about whether to build a sanctuary or a Christian Ed wing or what to do. And they had a cleanup day, and somebody went up in the attic and was organizing things and throwing things out, and they ran across the will that had bequeathed the home to the congregation. And they reread the will that had become their spiritual house, that had made possible their spiritual home, and it was not given for worship, incidentally, but it had been given so that that congregation, its forebears, could have a place to provide education of things of the Spirit to young people. And they read the will to the whole congregation. And remembering that that's who they were, they went forward with their building plans and built the Christian Ed wing, because that past was so important to them. Third thing is that habits are more powerful than intentionality. Norms and customs, traditions, rituals, you might summarize all of that and say culture. That which we're used to doing, that we don't have to think from square one and plan in detail, that which we can just enter into is important in the way in which we work. We're not rationally organized in the small church. I used to think that intentionality, is that a buzzword up here in the Atlantic provinces? It sure was down in southern New England. Everything had to be intentional. At one point I thought intentional was a four-letter word. Now I'm not saying we shouldn't be deliberate, but small churches work out of the habits and the patterns that they're used to. Our ways become mores. There's some moral credibility that attaches to the way we do things. It's not just functional behavior, it's right behavior, it's righteous behavior. And we're much wiser to work with it than against it. Had one example of this of Block Island was our Sunday school teacher wanted to do some evangelism, I guess you'd say, or at least pre-evangelism, and get the word out about our Sunday school program and offerings to the families in our community that weren't going to any church. And so she had the question of how to do that. And what she decided to do was, she got a list from the school and identified the families, and then she called the covered dish supper. Well, we know how to do covered dish suppers, so the whole church shows up and brings casseroles and this and that, and she just asked us to make extra large casseroles, and she went and invited those particular families to come, and between the meal and dessert, she talked about her hopes and what she expected for the Sunday school in the upcoming year and how welcome their children would be there. It was a whole lot more harmonious for her to engage in that kind of activity because we were used to doing it. She could just make a slight shift that helped open it up for us. The fourth is that in the small church we're a unified social sphere. We rather be that way than compartmentalized. Life is integrated, it's coherent, it's of a piece, it has a wholeness to it. And so Jesus' story about the 99 sheep being safe in the pen and the one being lost. This makes a whole lot of sense to us in the small church, because when one significant person is missing, there's a hole in our world. There's a hole in our social fabric. Of course, it also works in reverse. When we have 100 people there and somebody new shows up, we want to figure out, who the heck is this person? I remember one of my deacons coming up to me during coffee hour, grabbing my elbow and whispering to me, "Who's that over there?" "John, she's just as much a stranger to me as she is to you. Why don't you go say hi?" But that would have been a challenge. But that somebody new had come in and put a ripple in his sphere of social integration. It was real clear. The fifth is that we work with invested elders more than with elected officers. This is very, very frustrating to recent seminary graduates. You've got bylaws, you go through a process, democratic, official, top of the table, and it doesn't mean a blessed thing. Over time, people demonstrate their character and their abilities, and so we invest them with the trust that they will continue to minister to the Church of Jesus Christ in that way. Sometimes they inherit this unofficial office over the generations. Usually demonstrated competence and trust is a problem solver administratively. I've worshipped in a church on Sunday, and I preached, and I was standing with the pastor, shaking everybody's hand on the way out, good sermon pastor and all that. And this one gentleman comes up, and the pastor says to him before he can say anything, says, "Did you hear that the bubbler over by the Sunday school is broken? Could you get on that?" And the guy says, "Yep, I'll be there tomorrow." So, that's his office. That's his role in the church, and we trust him to do that. We don't work through bylaws so much, although we need to appeal to them when issues come up. We don't work through Robert's Rules of Order so much. I'd like to tell you a story about Robert's Rules of Order. Colonel Robert was a deacon in one of the churches that is now one of the ones that I work with, the First Baptist Church in New Bedford. Colonel Robert was not a clergyman. He was a military person stationed in New Bedford, but he was the moderator of that church. During the Civil War, the city of New Bedford heard that the Confederates were sending up a warship to shell the port of New Bedford, and this panicked the local people. So they got together at the First Baptist Church, because it was a large meeting house, and they got together like at sunup and were there till sundown. It was this very long meeting, and it got very, very hostile and aggressive, and fights broke out. People were yelling and screaming at one another. Turns out the Confederates never showed up, and the good old Union folk beat themselves up, but Colonel Robert was so taken or so shaken by this base level of behavior in a public meeting that over the next 4 years he penned this manual that we now know as Robert's Rules of Order. And the good news for us is that it was not a church meeting that caused him to do that. It was a town meeting. But in the small church, we don't tend to operate that way. Even if we give lip service to it, we have certain people that we trust, and we give them the authority. And so you will encounter this at a regular meeting of the trustees or deacons, wherever it is, some vote is taken, and then by the time people have left the parking lot, the vote is untaken. Or committees that will hem and haw and won't make any decision that night, not because they don't have a quorum, they do have a quorum, but because the key person whose concurrence on this issue has to be obtained is not present. Can't do anything until Uncle Joe says it's all right. May not always be the most efficient way to work, but it actually It's not a half bad way to work, and it's the way we enjoy working in small churches. Okay, let me wrap things up here. The small church, I believe, is God's design from the beginning. We're not the runt of the litter, we're the normative form of the body of Christ. We're out of step with society, and that makes it hard, but it also makes it transformative. If we were right in line with society, what alternative would we have to offer? Leading in the small church can be fun, believe it or not, when you understand this nature of the small church. And I believe the small church has the form of heaven. May not always have the content of heaven, but I believe that it does have the form that will anticipate heaven. Let me get back to Swansea. I had a pastor who for the last about 3 years there was physically ill and could barely perform in her role as a pastor. And yet, they just hung with her, supported her, accepted the ministry that she could give, compensated as they could, until she was able to retire and go live with her son and get a support system that was going to work for her. Their love, you see, was greater than their ability or their desire to perform at some external standard. The internal criteria of caring for the needy one in our midst was number one. But after their pastor left, they had a long interim period where they were desperately trying to find a pastor. They were not paying of what we call a full-time salary, and I challenged them to say if they could see if they could improve that. The association gave them a little bit to help them with that, and they increased their pledges $7,000 in 1 year to do that. That gave me enough courage to go talk to Charlie. Charlie had been for 18 years a small church pastor in the neighboring state. Then he had been called to one of our larger churches, and from the moment, virtually the first moment he was there, he knew it was a mistake. During his installation service, which he had planned, he invited friends and colleagues and mentors to all come and say a couple words. The service ran over an hour. The deacons got up and suspended the installation service because it went over their time frame. We do things this way. The human dimension, the sacredness of the moment. Charlie saw the handwriting of the wall right there. And I went to Charlie and said, you know, I think Swansea's struggling with their finances, but they could come close. Would you go down and talk with them? And he said, oh, okay, I'll go talk with them. He went there, they called him, he accepted. He's been there coming on to a year now, and he tells me it's the best move he ever made. These people are great. I love them, and they love me, and we're doing good ministry together. And I said, well, we probably can go another year on that subsidy. And he says, I don't think you're going to need to. I think they're responding, and their last newsletter, not that dollars measure everything, but measures a little something. They were $600 over for the last month, and doing well, and he's feeling the joy of ministry again. So, I think small churches can be beautiful places. They're central to God's plan for ministry. And I'm mighty proud to be able to maybe help you see a little more clearly that that's the truth. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. I have to touch bases back with the Bible passage, right? Let me not forget the Bible. I asked you a question. Wouldn't it be, or what would you give to have Jesus gesturing and saying, here are my brothers, my sisters, my mother, my family? I want to suggest to you That's exactly what Jesus does every Sunday morning in your church. Amen. Okay.